Hello everyone. My name is Daniel Meyer, and I'm a co-chair of this panel with David Newman. But apparently David Newman did not show up yet. So we are expecting him at some point, and that would be great. Also, there are some apparently missing panelists in this panel, which is a pity. I mean, for speaking about the Middle East. I mean, we need some people to talk about the Middle East. And so Anna Grichting she's not here. Oh, I'm afraid. Okay, she's a good friend. Sarah Merabti. Ah, you're here. Oh, thank you very much. I mean, I'm so happy to see you here, because Miles is here. And Alexandra. Oh, you're here. Thank you very much. So maybe Sarah, you're supposed to start, if it's fine for you. Okay. So we are going to start immediately without David Newman, but maybe he will come later. Sarah Merabti is from University of Paris-Est, and she's going to present Governing Without Government, Border Management in Libya after the fall of Gaddafi. I'll leave you the floor.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me here. I'm Sarah Merabti, PhD student. Today, I will present a topic which is called Governing Without Government, Illicit Border Management in Western Libya, and it's based on my PhD. So this presentation, as I said, is based on my PhD and fieldwork in Western Libya in the summer of 2017. The aim is to understand how illicit trafficking is rooted in local society and how it affects the local dynamics, and how illicit monitoring of the borders take place in Libya. First, I will present the fieldwork sites and then the main findings. First fieldwork site is Zwara. As you can see, it's a port city and entry point between north and west, Western Libya and Tunisia. And Zwara is populated by 350 million population. They are mostly Berbers or Amazigh, and they were strongly opposed to the Gaddafi regime. Today, Zwara is regarded as hub of smugglers. Second fieldwork site is Derj. It's a small oasis in southwestern Libya, and it's populated by 500 from different ethnic groups. You have Tuareg, Berbers, and Zintan. Derj population supported Gaddafi, and they created a sort of army to protect the regime, and they call it the counter-revolution. This place, or this city, Derj, lacks basic infrastructure, and economy is based on camels and livestock and smuggling. The third fieldwork site is Nalud. It's a mountainous area populated by Berbers, 2,700. And it's the entry, and it's the main entry point between South Tunisia and Libya, and the economy is based on smuggling, especially fuel smuggling. The fourth and last fieldwork site is Ghadames, and it's situated in southwest Libya, and it's historically known as an economic hub between Southern Africa and Sahel, and Europe and North Africa. Ghadames is populated by Amazigh or Berbers from Tuareg and Gadamsi, and the cohabitation between these two ethnic groups was a little bit difficult, especially after the revolution, because Berbers or Gadamsi, they were against Gaddafi, and Tuareg were pro-Gaddafi. Now I will talk about who are involved in the illicit trafficking networks. There are militias who were active during the revolution, and they have the revolution legitimacy, so they monitor the borders, they control them, and they are called revolutionaries by the local population. A local leader told me that militias who were legitimized by the transitional authorities control the illicit trafficking activity. They punish those who smuggle without their agreement. Militias created a kind of public services, so they monitor the borders, and the local populations need to pay a tax. There are also armed smugglers, who many belong to the same tribe as the revolutionary militias, except in some cases, like in Derg, where the population mainly is pro-Gaddafi and the militias against Gaddafi. Smugglers from other tribes, as I said, can ties links with militias based only on economic interests, even if they were, during the revolution, anti or pro-Gaddafi. How do they operate on the ground? The transitional authority don't have any control of the borders, so the militias are the sole people, who control the borders. I made an interview with customs official, and he told me no officials in the transitional authority care about the situation here, and no official has made a visit to this checkpoint. And it was the main checkpoint between Libya and Tunisia. There is an easy coexistence between militias and the security officials. We always hear about this cohabitation between these two, or the integration of militias in the local institutions. But the cohabitation is so difficult between them because officials are considered as pro-Gaddafi, even if they are not pro-Gaddafi till today. An ex-revolutionary told me that people who work under the ancient regime have no authority, and people respect me and see me as a legitimate because I made the revolution. But, there is an exception. Smugglers or militias sometimes cooperate with officials for economic interests. Smuggler told me, I work for a security officer. He has a big business, which is illicit trafficking, and how can he ever put me in jail? It's very easy to recruit locals into the smuggling economy because the economic situation is so hard after the collapse of Gaddafi. There are no basic services, for example, education, care. Smuggler in there told me I lost everything following the revolution, the Zintan, which is militia, came to my workplace and asked me to dig a well. When I requested payment, they tortured me for days. Once I was grazing my camels when they stopped me and took them from me. They accused me of being hostile to them because I am pro-Gaddafi. I've started working for them because I have a good knowledge of the desert. Another smuggler told me that I was sitting in the cafe one day. Someone asked me if I wanted to take this job, and I accepted. What do they smuggle? Smuggling of migrants is the most important in the different areas. And migrants have a kind of value, and they can be kidnapped and sold several times. So militias in every city have a sort of cooperation. So they take migrants from one point to another, and they created a kind of chain of command. And migrants can be kidnapped by another armed group, so they can be sold once again. There is also a hierarchy of migrants. It means that migrants from different countries don't pay the same price. So migrants from Syria pay between $300 and $1,000, and this is the same for Moroccans, but not Africans. A smuggler in there told me illegal migrants from Syria pay more than the others because they usually make a journey with their family members. They like to be alone. Moroccans also pay in euro or dollars. There are mostly young people who look for a better life in Europe. Africans pay less than others because they make a journey in groups. They sit up and down in cars. They accept it because they are used to hard conditions. There are also other goods which are smuggled: fuel, alcohol, drug, and cars from Dubai to Tripoli, and then they make their road to Ghadames and then to the Algerian borders. How do they smuggle across border? Mostly they rely on tribal networks in different countries, for example in Niger, Algeria, or Mali. A smuggler told me we rely on our kinship. African smugglers communicate in local dialects with illicit migrants. If someone speaks your dialect, you will feel more secure and comfortable to make a journey. The African smugglers are very well connected. Every group of 70 people have a delegate in Tripoli who is in charge of coordination. The smuggling is like a chain in different cities. As a smuggler stated, we carry migrants from the Algerian-Libyan borders to the limit of our city. We deliver them to another group who will do so with another group until the final destination, which is one of the Libyan coastal city. If we try to enter the territory of another group, we will take huge risk. They will kidnap migrants and kill us. We need to respect administrative limits. So they created other systems or illicit systems. Smugglers are very well informed and they take precautions. One migrant told me that since the illicit migrant became a target, they do not carry money anymore. They pay the journey in advance. Some swallow expensive stones or cocaine to pay their trip. Armed groups in the coastal city ask them to drink a substance, it is glycerine, in order to make sure that these people do not carry anything in their stomach. We do not keep them in the same place more than 24 hours. So they changed their strategy also. This is a smuggling road between Ghadames and Algeria, and usually they have different roads for illicit trafficking of drug or migrants. It's not the same road, and they have this kind of car, four-wheel cars, and usually they are they have a very good knowledge of the desert and also the policies in the different countries, like in Algeria. What are the impacts on local socio-economic dynamics? Smuggling has become an attractive way of life in different cities. Social worker told me young people are not attracted by education anymore. They compare themselves to other people of their age who have access to cars, telephones, and money. For that reason, they accepted to be hired by smugglers. And smugglers has created also inequalities inside the society and new division in the society, because we can see people who suffer from the economic collapse and others who take profit advantage of the illicit trafficking. Also, smuggling of goods out of Libya creates scarcity, for example, of basic needs like milk or tomatoes box. Militia also, but there is another relation in that also, where militias try to provide services. And they can, for example, militias can ask people if they need currency to contact them. So they provide another kind of service to make them more legitimate. There is another impact also on not only on socioeconomic dynamics but on state building in Libya. It is becoming very difficult to control these areas by official authorities, because militias who I interviewed told me that they won't give this monopoly of violence to official authorities. Here you can see, for example, what I said. It's a village in Derj, and this is on the right, house of a big smuggler, and other houses, I mean, in the village. So you can see the contrast or the difference. What is the role of the local civil society? The European Union wants them to play a role, but they can't, because they are afraid and they are threatened by militias. Many elders were kidnapped. There is also another problem, which is generational problem between militias who are usually young and elders. One elder told me that they can't do anything because militias are armed and not them, and they are not protected. Here you can see the elder I interviewed in Nalud, and who stated that it's quite difficult to talk about this subject, or this taboo subject. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So I think we move to the next paper on Alexandra Rilke, and actually you did the research with Claudio Minca, if I'm not wrong, but you're presenting alone. Yes, you're okay. So you're from Wageningen University and Research, and the title of the paper is Checkpoint 300: Rethinking Checkpoint Materialities in the Occupied Palestinian Territories. Give you the floor.
Yes, so thank you very much for being here. Indeed, my name is Alexandra Rijke. I'm a PhD candidate from the Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And I'm presenting today a paper that has been co-written together with my PhD supervisor, who couldn't be here, and that's Professor Claudio Minca. The title is a little bit different from the title that is in the book. It's based on a paper that is in the process of revision at the moment. And the title now is Inside Checkpoint 300, Checkpoint Regimes as Spatial Political Technologies in the Occupied Palestinian Territories. Yes. So in 2003, the Israeli Defense Forces, or the IDF, launched a program called Another Life in the Occupied Palestinian Territories. And the aim of this program was to minimize the damage of the occupation to Palestinian life, to avoid a humanitarian crisis that would necessitate the IDF to completely take over the provision of food and services to the Palestinian population. As explained by Israeli architect Eyal Weizman, this included minimizing the disruptive effects of the many Israeli checkpoints that started to appear in the Palestinian territories in the 1990s. In the aftermath of the occupation of the Palestinian territories in 1967, the mobilities of Palestinians was still relatively unconstrained. While they needed personal permits to travel to Israel or East Jerusalem, this restriction on their mobility was of relatively low impact. However, this changed dramatically after the first checkpoints started to appear in the 1990s. And since the 1990s, in fact, an increasingly dense network of checkpoints was established to intensify the control over the movement of Palestinians. This process was accelerated since the construction of the wall started in 2002. Inspired by existing debates, in the paper I'm presenting today, Claudio Minca and myself approached the checkpoint analyzed as part of what Eyal Weizman has famously defined as the architecture of occupation. This architecture of occupation is made up today of the wall, 98 checkpoints, numerous fences, Israeli settlements, bypass roads, roadblocks, and no-go military zones. Due to this architecture of occupations, Palestinians are often unable to travel inside the West Bank or to East Jerusalem or Israel without taking several detours and passing through checkpoints. These daily journeys may entail long queues, arbitrary implementation of rules by checkpoint managers, and humiliating and at times violent encounters between Palestinians and IDF soldiers or private security guards. To minimize the effects of the checkpoints as part of Another Life program, the IDF introduced a set of newly conceived checkpoints, so-called terminal checkpoints. These new checkpoints were designed to seemingly address the humanitarian concerns and minimize the encounters between Palestinians and the Israeli forces, thanks to the deployment of so-called machines. These machines, and examples of them are turnstiles, as you can see in the picture, metal detectors, X-ray machines, and finger and iris scanning devices. The terminal checkpoints were thus supposed to represent neutral border crossings with fixed passage regulations. However, as I will argue in this presentation, and we elaborate much more on in the paper, they remain places of tensions and arbitrary power enactments directed at Palestinian bodies. The paper presented here today is focused on one of these terminal checkpoints, namely Checkpoint 300 in Bethlehem. It is one of the busiest checkpoints in the West Bank. An average of 15,000 Palestinians passes through the checkpoint each morning. We have analyzed Checkpoint 300 as a political technology, operationalized through the use of the material devices present. We looked in particular at the ways in which Palestinian commuters and the Israeli forces present interact with these material devices. This research is based on a 6-month field period of fieldwork spent in the Bethlehem area in 2016 and 17, during which I have used multiple methods to collect data, including in-depth home interviews, go-along interviews, and participant observation. Moreover, I have spent an average of 8 hours each week at Checkpoint 300 during these months, often during rush hour from 4 to 8 a.m., and I have passed through Checkpoint 300 on numerous occasions, alone and with my interviewees on their go-along interviews. In the paper that I'm presenting today, or on which this presentation is based, we have adopted a spatially mobile methodology. So we discuss 3 checkpoint passages and reflect on how the power of the machines present inside the checkpoint is exercised on different bodies at different moments, and how Palestinian commuters accept, manipulate, or reject their workings, often engaging with the machines in all these 3 manners during one passage. So to illustrate this shortly here, how we have done this, I will provide the example of the metal detectors and X-ray machines. So I have a small layout of the checkpoint, Checkpoint 300, and I'm focusing, does this work? This does work, great. On this area here, so the metal detector and X-ray machine area, one enters the checkpoint from the Palestinian side or from the Bethlehem side to just General Lane, goes through one turnstile, enters the main building, goes through a second turnstile, which I couldn't fit in the picture, so you just have to imagine that it's also there, and then enters the metal detector rooms, of which there are 3. Once having gone through, you get in line for the permit checks, of which there are 10, not 6, but again, didn't want to make the picture too big, and then exit on the way to Jerusalem. Let me see. So when passing through the checkpoint after entering the main building, one is confronted with a metal detector and X-ray machine. These machines allow the soldiers to see what everyone is carrying, and here this is one of these examples that you can find anywhere in airports and shopping malls or whatever, so they're a bit the same. So it allows the soldiers to see what everyone is carrying and alert them in case of the presence of metal objects. In this way, the machines are initiated as replacing any intimate physical contact between Palestinian commuters and Israeli forces with the ostensibly less intrusive act of seeing. Israeli scholar Iris Braverman, who interviewed numerous high-ranking Israeli military officials about these terminal checkpoints and the machines that were introduced in them, explains in her work that this indirect interaction reliant on sensory technology is described by the Israeli army officials as being more humane. The commuter can be alerted by the machine that she or he is carrying something with her or him, and in this way avoid being touched by anyone. The decision about whether or not someone may continue without problems is made solely by the machine. If one responds correctly to the loud beep of the metal detector by going back and forth and removing the suspect item, the machine will remain silent, a sign that the commuter is allowed to continue. And this process can take place several times, going back and forth, without any interaction necessary with the Israeli soldiers inside the control room. As we elaborate on in the article, our Palestinian interviewees indicated that this lack of communication and the fact that they were instructed by a machine felt particularly dehumanizing. Also, while going back and forth through the machine, our interviewees often indicated they relied more on the responses of the Israeli forces to the beeping than the beep itself. So to provide you with some insights into the relationship between Palestinian commuters and the metal detectors and the X-ray machine inside Checkpoint 300, I will read out some sections here of a go-along interview I had with Nisreen, a 54-year-old Palestinian woman who lives in Bethlehem and travels to Checkpoint 300 5 times a week on her way to work in Jerusalem. So I read from my field notes. We enter the X-ray machine and metal detector room, and there are no trays on this side of the metal detector. Nisreen has to move back and forth through the metal detector, causing a loud beep both times to get a tray. No response from the soldiers. During my first interview with Nisreen a few weeks ago, she mentioned how unpredictable the metal detectors are. The soldiers can play with the sensitivity of the machine. Sorry, this is a quote of Nisreen. The soldiers can play with the sensitivity of the machine. The same shoes, the same item of jewelry, sometimes they beep and sometimes not. End of quote. While she felt that the level of sensitivity of the metal detector was higher during periods of increased tension between Israelis and Palestinians, she also indicated that often there seemed to be no specific reason for the increase in sensitivity. Again, a quote, "This is the checkpoint, every day is a surprise." End of quote. So what these field notes indicate is the unpredictable workings of the metal detector and what happens when machines do not work as expected. While this does not necessarily mean that they are failing or behaving in conflict with their rationale, or even with the rationale of the checkpoint itself, since they nonetheless assess the bodies of the commuters, their unpredictability significantly affects the commuters' mobility and the daily whereabouts. One day they may pass without problems, and the next day the machine may decide otherwise. Its loud beep forcing them to move back and forth, often several times, shedding their possessions in the process to be able to pass. So when asked what she does when the machine beeps, Nisreen explains that she normally continues. And again, I quote, "I beep very often, and if he," and he here is an Israeli soldier, "doesn't tell me to turn back, I don't turn back. I don't even look at them." So here, sorry, that was too quick. So here we can see that Nisreen rejects the workings of the machine. She does not listen to the machine's decisions, but waits for the soldiers to tell her what to do. However, at times the soldiers do respond and decide that the beep of the machine matters, and consequently ask her to move back and forth until the metal detector remains silent. To avoid this, she preventively checks at home with a magnet if her clothes or jewelry could possibly activate the metal detector, avoiding these items on busy mornings or during tense periods, hence behaving as intended by the checkpoint regime. So in this, the paper that I'm presenting here today very shortly, we have analyzed Checkpoint 300 in Bethlehem as a spatial political technology by focusing in particular on the interactions between Palestinian commuters, Israeli forces, and the machines operating inside the checkpoint. Passing through a checkpoint is a daily exercise many Palestinians cannot avoid on their way to work, school, their families, or their mosque or church. Terminal checkpoints were originally introduced by the Israeli government as so-called neutral border crossings, aimed at minimizing the impact of these barriers on Palestinian life. And one way this was done, as I explained here, hopefully clearly, was through a different design and the use of several machines, such as turnstile, metal detector, X-ray machines, and finger and iris scanning devices. And the presence of these machines were supposed to increase the distance between soldiers and Palestinian commuters, and accordingly decrease the tension amongst them. However, as I've hopefully shed some light on in this presentation, Checkpoint 300 is still a place filled with tension and violence, often exercised by the machines and operations and their decisions. The passages described here, described in the paper, of which I provided a short example, show the ways in which the material agency of the machines is exercised on different bodies and in different moments. The passages highlighted the diverse ways in which Palestinians interact with, reproduce, but also challenge the workings of the machines inside Checkpoint 300, ranging from behaving as intended by the machines to trying to minimize the chance of clashing with them or even actively rejecting them. To conclude, the brutal materialities of the checkpoint regime significantly affect the daily lives and mobility of the Palestinian commuters, with the machine's deliberations marking the body of the individual subjected to their decisions, from beeping to remaining silent, from reading their biometrical identities to refusing to do so, and from the contact of the turnstile's arms to their subtle but liberatory clicking. What has emerged here by incorporating the agency of these machines in our analysis is that Checkpoint 300 is a porous barrier whose regime is produced and reproduced by an endless interplaying among Palestinian commuters, Israeli forces, and a series of technological devices. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, for this sharp and fascinating paper. We have actually plenty of time. This is great. And I'm pretty sure that Miles Williams will be extremely happy to have enough time to present his paper on the divided Druze, legacies of colonial partition for an historical persecuted minority. Please, I'll leave you the floor. You have enough time, yes.
Right, good morning. I can't tell if you're awake or asleep. There's no light on, so I'll just assume the best. And begin by reminding you of the theme of our ABS conference. I and Danielle both were at the first ABS World Conference in Joensuu, Finland. And the title of ours is Border Making and Its Consequences, Interpreting Evidence from the Post-Colonial and Post-Imperial 20th Century. And I see my paper as a case study that fits directly into the conference theme. And I do so by using, as a case study, an understudied but compelling religious minority. And that is the Druze, whom I well understand are not known by most people, And one of the reasons is, if you know anything about the Druze, it's that you can't know about the Druze religion because it's a secret, or so they say. So at the risk of divulging some secrets, I will go ahead but focus on the border implications of this historically persecuted minority. So, for most students of the regime, of the region, the expression divided Druze conjures this image from the Golan Heights, occupied by Israel since 1967. This image of Syrian Druze trying to reconnect with Druze in Israel. Now, this particular image of a Syrian bride trying to see her groom in Israel is actually fictional and comes from this movie of the same name, which I highly recommend. But here are some real images beginning in 1967, when the Golan Heights were captured by Israel, into more recent times. This picture taken from the Israeli side, and this picture taken from the Syrian side. But I wish to put the notion of the divided Druze into a much broader, into a worldwide context of the legacies of colonial partition for indigenous peoples separated into adjoining French and British colonies. A worldwide phenomenon, as shown in this map, and to focus on particularly their borderlands, where former French colonies abut against former British ones. Now, 3 cases where I have already conducted research and published are maritime. This example in the West Indies, the Indian Ocean, and the South Pacific. One case study I've looked at is riverine, that is the Mekong River separating formerly British Burma from former French Indochina, and particularly Laos. The Mekong is the blackened border. But I've also looked already at 2 land boundaries, one in India and the other in West Africa. Now, I've already put all of these case studies in a book that I presented at, in Joensuu at the first ABS World Conference. And at that conference, at that presentation, I acknowledged the gap in this otherwise global treatment of Anglo-French borderlands, the Middle East, where the colonial mandate of Anglo-French borders were those between Iraq and Jordan, with Syria, between Lebanon and Palestine, and between Syria and Palestine. So this paper is my attempt to fill that gap, and it's based on 6 months of field work along the Lebanese-Israeli border, but for political reasons, only on one side of that border, which is why I didn't include it in Scars of Partition. Anyway, the basic question is, do the conclusions of Scars of Partition hold up in this Middle Eastern example? A perspective coming from political psychology. A conclusion coming from colonial historiography. a conclusion coming from political sociology, and my fourth conclusion comes from the sociology of religion, in which I argue that for every religion, the practice or the contours of that faith are shaped by the different countries in which those religions are represented and are practiced. So, my conclusion is, in the Middle East, yes. Same set of conclusions. And I could stop there, although I have a lot more material. But in case you have to leave, that is actually where I'm heading. By taking the case of the Druze, who were, by French-British colonial partition, divided again into two former French and two former British holdings, taking over from the Ottoman Empire, and most famously being divided, or I should say redivided, by the Sykes-Picot Treaty of 1916. Mark Sykes represented the United Kingdom, and Georges Picot representing France, in which they blithely decided to divide the Middle East in the way that you see now. And I like this particular color map, and contrast it soon with the result of a less known but more important conference, the San Remo one, which actually determined how the Sykes-Picot Agreement would be territorially implemented. And these are the two maps that really are at the heart of what I want to say. That the Sykes-Picot Treaty generally divided the Francophone Middle East from the Anglophone Middle East, but the San Remo Conference is the one that made those boundaries more specific and wound up dividing the Druze in a particular way. So now I shift to the question, were the Druze better impacted by being under French or British colonial rule? And in order to answer this question, I'm going to focus on one individual, Sultan al-Atrash, who was in what is today called Syria under the French, but could not stand the French, and launched a rebellion known as the Druze Rebellion between 1925 and 1927. Eventually, he was captured and exiled into British territory, where he learned to appreciate British colonial rule much more than French colonial rule. And throughout the Middle East, you'll see these statues of him today. A hero of the Druze in his fight against the French. So this is the map of contemporary Druze land, if I can say. And just to give you a few demographics, the Druze exist mostly in Syria, 600 to 700,000, which is about 3% of the national population of Syria. But 43% of all the Druze in the world live there. And we'll go to the Civil War later in my presentation and how the current Civil War impacts the Druze. Second is Lebanon, where the Druze represent 6% of the national population, but 40% of Druze around the world. And they're mostly in the Shuf Mountains and a religious concentration in Hasbaya. The third concentration of Druze is in Israel, where they are less than 2% of the Israeli population, and only 8% of all Druze worldwide. Jordan is a fourth area where the Druze are represented, but they're actually a spillover from Syria. So it may seem counterintuitive, but I'm going to say something about military, the role of the Druze in the military and their religion at the same time. And it begins with this precept, not unique to the Druze, but this belief in predestination results in this military or warrior-like psychology. And this precept of the Druze religion has the exception, in practical terms, that force can be permitted. And a kind of pre-modern Westphalianism takes the form that wherever you live, you must be loyal to the ruler. And finally, whether or not you believe in reincarnation, think about the implications of reincarnation for soldiering. It doesn't matter when you die, because you're going to be reborn, if you're a Druze, immediately. It's not the end. And so therefore you find, for these and other reasons, that the Druze are prominent in the militaries of all 4 of those countries in the Middle East in which they're represented. This is Imad Fares. He's the Brigadier General of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, which were mentioned in the previous presentation. He's the first Druze infantry brigade commander in Israel. And Hassan Alian is the second commander of the IDF infantry brigade, and he is the chief paratrooper officer today. Major General Yusuf Mishleh is the coordinator of government activities in the region that was just presented, Checkpoint 360, in other words, in the occupied territories in the 2000s, really crystallizing the ambivalent position of the Druze in Israel, who are a bridge between the Israeli government, which they serve, and the Arab-speaking population, which they help to govern in the occupied territories. I'll just say that Arabic is the mother tongue of the Druze, even if they are neither Muslim nor Christian. And the Brigadier General Dr. Tarif Bader, who is the Chief Medical Officer of the IDF. Previous to that, he was involved in humanitarian actions on behalf of Israel, another prominent Druze in uniform. But over in Lebanon, Yusuf Shamit, who was the second longest serving army commander in Lebanese history, and who started a tradition by which it is a Druze who is the chief of staff of the Lebanese army. And in Syria, these are people whom you probably have seen before. On the right is Wali Jumblat, the son of Kamal, an assassinated head of the Progressive Socialist Party in Syria. And I don't need to mention who he's sitting next to. But the prominence of the Druze in the Syrian military go back to Major Salim Khattoum, who was a prominent coup plotter and the unsuccessful plotter of a counter-coup. Syrians will know of this Syrian army commander, Abdul Karim Zahr al-Din, in the early 60s, but nowadays, the major general in the middle in Syria, Issam Jadan Zahreddin, he has two nicknames, depending on which side of the Syrian civil war you're on. He is either known as the Lion of the Republican Guard, as being Bashar Assad's shock troop leader, or he is the Druze beast for being so effective in fighting for Bashar Assad. Just a couple of the books that I have consulted in this presentation, and now we go to what is happening to the Druze in the civil war. The Syrian war has split the Druze internally and cross-border. Remember Sultan al-Trash, head of the Druze revolt? His granddaughter has favored the populist revolt in favor of a pro-democratic Syria. And on the other side, the Druze beast, whom I just showed you, he actually was killed in combat just a couple of years ago. You have Walid Jumblat in Lebanon, who takes one side in the issue, and the Israeli government has been pressured by the Druze, particularly in uniform in Israel, to try to protect the Druze who have been targeted by ISIS and the al-Nusra Front. So here are just a few images from my own fieldwork site where I've been studying the Druze on the Israeli side, along the border and in the borderland. You're just looking into Lebanon in the previous pictures and in this picture as well. The Druze are prominent in the border police because they know the area. This is the border police is what is said here. And these are three interesting gentlemen, not so much by what they are doing while on patrol, but what they do in their day job. The volunteer on the left, he is a Hebrew teacher in the Druze school. The officer in the middle, he's also a teacher of the Hebrew language in the Druze school. And the officer on the right, he's the principal of one of the elementary schools in the village where I was doing my research. On prominent Druze holidays, the Israeli Druze scouts go on parade. And you have what I call Druze Zionists, this particular martial arts instructor who proudly, if you can see his arms, and now you can better see his arms, has tattooed the symbols both of the Druze people in the middle, the Magen David, the Star of David, as you see on the left, and I don't have to explain about the yin-yang on the right-hand side. Most Druze do not tattoo themselves with Stars of David, but that's an example. Here I have a video clip, I won't show it, but of the Druze actually making music as they march. So my final words is that a British mandate over all of Palestine following the First World War was preordained neither by God nor by history. Had the original boundaries of the Sykes-Picot Treaty not been changed at the San Remo Conference, there are Druze borderland communities in what today is Israel, which would have experienced French rather than British colonialism, and Lebanese rather than Israeli independence. That would have taken us 100 years already. So think of those highly decorated Israeli officers, Druze officers, whom I introduced you to earlier, who are from the Upper Galilee of Israel. Had colonial contingency been different, they would be from villages attributed not to Israel, but to Lebanon. They would be in a completely different mindset, a different psychology, obviously different loyalties, and what goes for them goes for their families and for their communities. It stretches the imagination to think of how different the aspirations, the life histories, the life prospects, the mentalities of the Druze living in those same exact villages today, how different they would have been had those Anglo-French partition lines in the first 2 decades of the 20th century been different. And so, and with this I conclude, to understand the divided Druze today, one must appreciate the Anglo-French partition of the Middle East, its contemporary aftermath, and the theology of this exceptionally loyal people to whomever history has apportioned them in their colonial and post-colonial boundaries. C'est tout.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's an excellent idea, yeah. Mais is just suggesting to, that the panelists would gather here. Unfortunately, there is only one chair. There are other chairs over there? Okay, wonderful. And so, please join. I'm going to just say a few things about these various presentations, maybe raising questions, because we have enough time just to start the debate. And please. First of all, thank you for being here. I mean, because apparently that was not totally obvious. I mean, the previous panel, nobody showed up. So, first of all, more seriously, oh yes, is it possible to change the light? I mean, okay. Oh yeah, thank you. Just because, I mean, you are in the dark, and yeah, it's a little bit better now. Okay, thank you. Okay, so thank you all of you for presenting really interesting and fascinating papers. Let me just say a few things. First, Sarah, I mean, thank you for sharing with us, I mean, elements of your research in Libya, in borderland region actually, and uneasy places, I mean, to do research, where to do research on, yeah, I mean, topic that might need actually a deep involvement, I mean, in the field work, I mean, and maybe you can I would like to hear maybe a little bit more about your methodology and I mean how you succeed to create, I mean, this to build this confidence. I mean, also with local smugglers, local inhabitants also. I mean, yeah. I mean, basically that's. That's just one thing I wanted to hear about. Alexandra, I mean, this was extremely interesting what you were saying about dehumanization and on the one hand, I mean, as an impression regarding this checkpoint machines, and on the other hand, the claim of humanizing, I mean, the process. So I think we are here at the also at the at the crossroad of something that is related to relationship between, I mean, the Israeli army and the Palestinians, and this. I just wanted to have your. Some comments and impression also about this process of distance, physical distance that is slowly being introduced. I mean, slowly, it's not really slow, but now it is clearly introduced. Also, I mean, when we observe from the first Intifada, then the second Intifada, I mean, the distance between the soldiers and the occupied population. So that's also a matter of a larger framework regarding what you are saying about these new technicalities that are put in shape in border and checkpoints. And Miles, I mean, your large spectrum brought us, I mean, in various directions and in various countries. Thanks for suggesting various ways. I mean, at some point you were raising questions and issues that were related to your book about borderlands effects and I would also like to hear a little bit more in the conclusion of what you found actually about the Jews regarding these borderlands. I mean, would you define them as borderland peoples? And if yes, I mean, how would you, I mean, raise this question regarding your fieldwork and I mean the people also, the people you presented. I mean and the question of the loyalty and the loyalty to whom actually. Thank you. So that's my first question. And maybe we could also take some questions immediately in order to, yeah. Okay. Yes.
political situation. I have one question. When you say the Jews in Israel are 2%, you take... When you say the Jews in Israel are 2% of the population, are you taking into account the Jews of the Golden Heights, also the Syrian Jews, or just like the one that we call the Israeli Jews? And you know, you're presenting this community as very unified, but it's very diverse, and you have very kind of diverse inner conflict in the Jewish community, which is within the borders of Israel, meaning the Syrian ones and the Israeli ones. And especially with the war in Syria, you have even more conflicting perspectives on the role of Israel towards Syria, and then on the role of the army, people within the army, people that are not with the army. You have traditional religious leaders, and you have also other people that have different kind of perspective. And I would really like to have your take on that, on, you know, like a sociologist, you know, and to give us some information about these communities, how you
Thank you. Another question over there.
Thank you very much, Chair. I have also a question to all the three speakers. I'm always interested in the circumstances under which research is being conducted, and Sarah is absolutely fascinating. I would like to know two things. First of all, in which language did you interact? I suppose you speak Arabic, but I mean, their dialects. I mean, how was this interaction? How could you communicate? Second one is really where you engage in. I mean, you were treading on very many toes there, I suppose. And the other one, this is a huge topic, but I want to raise it. Of course, these days the smuggler networks are the bête noire of Europe. I don't think we stand a chance of penetrating those networks unless we pay them ourselves. I mean, that would be the only possibility. As regards Alexander, first of all, also about the circumstances under which you conducted the research. You said you were there for 6 months, yes, and I mean, you probably communicated with your excellent English, not in Dutch, but in English. But for the rest, I mean, how did you interact with, in particular, the Palestinian population, the black? And then one question, what's so pernicious about machines? I mean, as you yourself probably, I flew in from Amsterdam yesterday, and well, I mean, I interacted with machines all the way, and without really protecting, except that I was also frisked once, which happens so many times. Now, Maris, thank you very much for clarifying to me that the Syrian riot was fictional. I took it for a fact. Yeah. So in the book that I have to make one small addition. The proofs are not yet out. And the other point is, I have been to a session about the Austrian-Hungarian Empire this morning, and there's a parallel session to this one. Exactly the same stories which you told about the Jews within the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. I mean, absolutely flabbergasting what I heard there. It's exactly the same. How, in this case, it's not colonial, but it's nationalistic regimes imposing new borders and endless divisions and suffering. So, yeah, I mean, this is just one additional comment. The phenomenon is absolutely not unique to post-colonialism or colonialism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Other questions, maybe? So I suggest that the speakers can use this microphone. I mean, it's a little bit better. So I leave you the floor. Maybe, Sarah, you start?
Thank you so much for your questions. I will answer to your question. Sorry, Daniel. About the methodology, yes, sorry, I took this slide because I wanted to respect time. It was very difficult to tie relations with people and gain their trust. I faced this spy syndrome also from Libyans. They were very, very skeptical. So I conducted 120 interviews. And I relied also on observation. I faced many challenges related to security, yes. For example, my university didn't fund my travel because it was so dangerous, yeah. I had different local contacts. So I traveled with Libyans from one city to another. It was quite safe when I was in one city because I knew the militias and I was a little bit secured. And it's very interesting how the security approach changed when you are inside and outside the city. When I met militias, I had the impression they were providing a service. They were protecting the population because they were from that population. They were a cousin, a brother of someone I knew. So it was quite not easy, but quite, I mean, not really difficult to tie relation with them. And then I had to participate to some cultural activities to gain their trust. I faced another challenge which is related to gender. I was not supposed to travel alone. And the first question, I remember once I had a meeting with elders. They were 12. I was the only woman in the room. And the first question there was, why do you travel alone? Where is your mahram, which is my brother or father or uncle? So yeah, I found many difficulties. Thank you. I don't know, it's was courageous or a little bit risky. Yeah. And because militias control and they monitor different cities, so it was safer to be inside than outside. I mean, these cities. Yeah, and I had to travel with cars because they don't have public transportation. It was not possible for me to travel in public transportation. So, yes, and I faced other difficulties like fuel scarcity and, yeah. For example, I booked my ticket to come back to Oslo, where I'm based now, but I didn't find someone to drive me to the Tunisian borderlands. So we had to buy fuel from a smuggler. Yeah, double price in order to, and the person is a member of local municipality. And he knew the smuggler in person, yes. Yeah, sorry, the language, I speak Libyan dialect. I'm Algerian, yeah, and I speak the Berber dialect, which is quite different from the Libyan one, yes. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the questions. I'll just go one by one. So first of all, my ideas about this physical distance that is introduced between soldiers or Israeli forces, because it's not just soldiers, it's also private security guards at the checkpoints. I didn't discuss this now, but it is an interesting issue. Based on what I can say, based on my own research, I would say is that it's been introduced as decreasing tension. But in the end, I think it's experienced as extremely dehumanizing by Palestinians. Also, maybe in relation to the question posed, what is sort of the problem with machines is that, well, one, you flying to Amsterdam is of course very different from Palestinians having to pass through a checkpoint that they don't want to pass through, but they have to pass through to get to work or wherever. Well, it's part of it. So part of it is the fact that it is an occupation. It's an occupied group, population that have to line up at 3 a.m. for the checkpoint to open at 4 a.m., to be at work at 8 a.m., to not lose your job, and then to get home at 7 p.m. or 8 p.m., depending on how far away your village is from the main checkpoint. So that is part of it, definitely. But I think also the machines itself, if you look at sort of the machines that are used, it's one, their arbitrary workings that I try to discuss a little bit here, is that the metal detector is not something that you can count on to work in a similar manner every day. But it's also the nature of them. For instance, the steel bars that you're always pushed against that are, so unwielding and harsh. And this whole dynamic of this place where this metal detector, the beep is so incredibly loud, and you just hear it constantly when you're inside the checkpoint. Beep, beep, beep. It's this whole sort of tendency that is created of, someone described it as a maze, one of my interviewees, that you're pushed through a maze as like a rat or a mouse that just has to respond to certain inputs that a master is sort of controlling. So I think in a way, yes, it is also very much the nature of the machines itself that make it very brutal, but it's also, of course, the location that it's placed in and the occupation and the fact that next to the beeping machine there's, you know, a 20-year-old soldier with a huge gun that will, you know, punish you if you don't listen to it, or not. And always this arbitrariness is so much part of everyday life. Talking about the physical distance more in general, you know, this is just my personal ideas, not my research. If you look at, for instance, the difference between Gaza and the West Bank, I think one of the reasons why, you know, you can kill 100 Gazans and they will never, in the current time, I think, kill 100 Palestinians in the West Bank is because of the distance. And it's because you look at them through, you know, the scope on your gun. And it's also the whole drone discussion, of course, where there's this humanization taking place of whatever subject you're intended to kill, who is actually not a subject, but an object, and killable. But that's just my own ideas, it's not necessarily my research. Let me see, what's the other question? Oh yeah, my interaction with Palestinians. Well, I've been coming to Bethlehem for years now, since 2013. Lived there for quite some time. So for me, I speak a little bit Palestinian, not enough to do my interviews, but enough to make contact with people. And you know certain words that are used in the checkpoint. So when I'm standing there for observations, I can just say like, oh, is the door closed? Yes, it's closed. Why is it closed? But then hope to understand the response or not. Most Palestinians in my interactions would always speak a couple of words English. So I think language-wise, it went so much more easy than I thought the first time when I came there. I think my problem, the difficulties with my interaction, I've also interviewed Israeli settlers for a different paper because they also go through checkpoints, of course, but very differently. But also in my interaction with the soldiers and the private security guard inside the checkpoint. So it was part of the interaction with the Israelis, what's much more tense and difficult for me because I really didn't want them to really know that I was a researcher, this sort of everyday soldiers there, because I was afraid I would get kicked out. So, and there was always this weird dynamic of, you know, like I said, a 19-year-old with a big gun, that if I would be talking to the wrong person, they could aim the gun at me and tell me to go away, which happened a couple of times. So that's, I think, a very different interaction than with Palestinians, which, you know, I mean, I've lived there for quite a long time and close friends. And at some point, I mean, I know Bethlehem is a city, but Bethlehem in a way is also a town. And yes, there are many white people, but not many white people who keep returning. So at some point, people knew me. And they knew I was what they would say a good girl. So someone who kept coming back and tried to do something more than just be there for a couple of interviews and then go away again, which many people do. So there was also part of the reputation. I think also you said you had to do certain rituals. I think it's a very different society, Bethlehem, because it's also very Christian, so it was not maybe very rituals, sort of traditional rituals, but there were also certain rituals I had to go through, as in getting a name in the city and being known as someone that could be trusted. I think that's were the questions, right? Yeah? Okay, thank you.
So thank you all for questions and feedback. Danielle, our chair, are the Druze a borderland people? Oh, there definitely are a borderland people. And how are they, to whom are they loyal as borderland people? So the first thing is to re-emphasize that the Druze, according to their religion and according to politics and history, are loyal to the regime under whom they reside. Now, because they are a minority in all of those countries, they do see themselves as a potential bridge of peace. That's particularly the case between Israel and the Palestinians, because who better can make the case that there can be a coexistence than Druze, Arabophones who are loyal to the state of Israel and believe that the current status quo is not tenable. In terms of being a borderland people and believing in the Druze faith, I have to go back to this issue of reincarnation. And this is the subject of a paper that Asher Kaufman gave at the first ABS World Conference, in which he focused on the period between 1982 and 2000, in which Israel controlled a swath of southern Lebanon. And Israelis, particularly soldiers, were able to cross back and forth. And one thing that happened is that, and I've seen this, I've witnessed this too, where a Druze, a young Druze, even a child, will have this image, this flash of his or her prior life. And according to the Druze, any Druze can go and find his former life's family and introduce himself or herself and then be received. Between 1982 and 2000, Asher Kaufman has documented cases of Israeli Druze finding their Lebanese former life families and being accepted, bridging that boundary not only in a political sense, but in a very profound spiritual sense. So in that case, that's my bridge to one of the points that I wanted to make to your question, or series of questions about the Druze and their identity. I really must have failed in conveying the sense in which the Druze are split, certainly by the Syrian civil war, that there are Druze who take the position for the Assad regime, like General Zahar al-Din, and the granddaughter of Sultan al-Atrash, who takes the opposite political vantage. And I must not have sufficiently conveyed the point that I don't believe that there is a Druze people, but there are Israeli Druze who are very different as a result of colonialism and post-colonialism, as opposed to Lebanese Druze, their identity, and Syrian Druze with their identity, and Jordanian Druze, although I didn't get into them. Because they are quite different, even though they share certain religious principles. Just one sentence from the paper in which I say that differences in outlook between Jordanian, Israeli, Lebanese, and Syrian Druze are just as great between Catholics in Slovenia, Italy, Chile, and America. So if in the oral presentation I didn't sufficiently convey how divided the Druze are in terms of loyalty, then I thank you for this opportunity to allow me to clarify that. You asked a demographic question of the between 130,000 and 150,000 Druze who are considered to live in Israel. About 40,000 of those live in the Golan Heights. And the Golan Heights do present a different level of division among the Druze than the external boundaries that I just evoked with Lebanon, Israel, Syria, and Jordan. Because there's an ambivalence. If the principle of the Druze faith is you should be loyal to the regime in which you reside, and if you are born in a place that, according to one interpretation, belongs to Syria, and according to another interpretation, belongs to Israel, to whom are you supposed to be loyal? And so the Golan Heights Druze have, in very recent years, been experiencing this conflict because traditionally in the Golan, they have tended to support Syria. But how do you support a state which is unraveling with the kind of brutality under which one of your co-religionists is called the Druze beast in the massacres that he allegedly led against other Syrians, and in a context in which now the Golan Heights has been under Israeli sovereignty longer than it has been under Syrian post-independence sovereignty, and where there is growing fear that if they have to choose between Israel and Syria, they have a choice between, well, depending on your political spectrum, lesser of two evils, either a country in which they're a double minority or a country in which they're targeted as by al-Nusra for death. So there are definitely different levels of partition and division among them. And finally, to the comparativist question, which I very much appreciated. Yesterday, I took a day at Schönbrunn, the palace here, and I was thinking of the Druze as I went through this relic of the Austro-Hungarian, yes, is that correct, to say, the Habsburg dynasty, in terms of modernization and how different Austria is today as opposed to that royalty situation. And the Druze, and I've actually presented about the modernization of the Druze, how the mentality has so shifted as a result of technology and science, some of the aspects that we were talking about earlier. So thank you for that comparativist angle. And the last thing, even though you didn't address the language question to me, I will take the liberty of saying I was living in a village where the language is Arabic, and where, except for shwai shwai and sabah al khair and a couple of other greetings, I don't know Arabic at all. And fortunately and unfortunately, fortunately for me and unfortunately for them, English is not very well spoken by Arabs and Druze of Israel, because Hebrew needs to be learned as their second language in order to succeed. There's this whole literature of linguistic imperialism which can be applied to any country. So my language of communication, my lingua franca with the Arabic-speaking Druze was solely in Hebrew. And Hebrew, which is associated with the Jewish people, but which is much better spoken by the Druze of Israel than by over half of the Jewish population of the world. And so there was this delicious pride that they took in improving my Hebrew, and even saying that their Hebrew is better than the Hebrew of most Jewish Israelis, because theirs comes from ancient Israel, whereas most Israelis, Jewish Israelis today, speak the Ashkenazi, European-inflected version of it. So, thanks for the language question.
Maybe we have one more question before closing the panel.
That's the next question.
Yes, please.
To add to what we just heard about the connection between the Druze in other area with you, because it found that now, not as you described the connection between the Catholics, but more the connection between the Jews all over the world, because now the Jews in Israel are pressing the Israeli government to help the Druze in Syria. So they see themselves as a nation that they had to protect one to other. So now it's a lot of pressure on Israeli government to help the Druze in Syria, especially when they were attacked by the Syrian government. So it's not that they are separated totally. This is one thing that I just want to add. It was one thing. And the other thing, thank you for raising the problem of the Sykes-Picot, because those who want to hear a little bit more about this and the San Remo conference are invited to hear my lecture in Budapest, which will deal with this. So when we will be in Budapest, I will enlarge it. So thank you for opening this session.
Thank you very much, Gideon. Yes, so in concluding this panel, thank you very much, all of you again for these brilliant papers and interesting and debatable topic. And again, following, the proposal of Gideon, yes, we are having 2 panels in Budapest on 13th of July in the morning. So I convey all of you to these 2 panels on Middle Eastern issues and border issues. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.